Silence can feel louder than betrayal. The unanswered prayers, the injustice that never got explained, the wound that still aches when you remember, the words they spoke or the actions they took. You tried to forgive, you tried to move forward, but part of your heart keeps asking, God, do you see what they did to me? And heaven seems quiet. Yet quiet does not mean absent. It does not mean God is indifferent. Often when God is working the deepest justice, he does it in ways the human eye cannot immediately detect. While you are healing, while you are growing, while you are learning to trust again, God is also dealing with those who hurt you, not out of cruelty, but out of truth, correction, and divine order. What you cannot see with your natural eyes, God is already shaping in the unseen realm. There comes a moment in every believer's life when pain collides with faith. You trusted someone, you opened your heart. You believed the best, and somehow you were wounded, betrayed, misunderstood, abandoned, or used. The scar may not be visible on your skin, but it lives in your memory. You replay the conversations, you relive the moments. You imagine what you would say if you ever had the chance to speak again. And yet God gently whispers to your spirit, release it to me, not because what happened didn't matter, but because vengeance belongs to him and restoration belongs to you. When God works in silence before he acts in visibility, it challenges the human desire for immediate proof and instant justice. We live in a world that measures progress by what can be seen, posted, announced, or validated publicly. If something is not visible, we assume nothing is happening. Yet God operates in dimensions that the natural eye cannot perceive. His silence is not emptiness. It is strategic movement. When you cry out in pain after being hurt, betrayed, or wronged, and heaven seems quiet, your heart may wrestle with doubt. You may ask yourself whether God truly noticed what happened, whether he truly cares, or whether justice will ever come. But the silence of God is often the evidence that he's arranging something deeper than what surface-level outcomes could ever accomplish. Silence allows God to work without interference. When everything is exposed too early, human emotions complicate the process. Pride, fear, revenge, misunderstanding, and impulsive reactions can distort what God is building. In silence, God reshapes hearts, redirects paths, and aligns consequences without noise or chaos. Just as a seed grows underground before breaking the surface, divine intervention develops in hidden places before revealing itself outwardly. Roots form before fruit appears. Strength develops before results are visible. If God were to act instantly in every situation, the lesson would be shallow and the transformation incomplete. But when he works quietly, the outcome becomes stable, lasting, and purposeful. There are seasons when God intentionally removes visible signs so that faith can mature. If every prayer was answered instantly and visibly, trust would never deepen. Silence forces dependence. It invites surrender. It teaches patience. It builds resilience. When you continue trusting God without evidence, your faith becomes anchored in who he is, not just in what he does. This kind of faith does not collapse when circumstances fluctuate because it is rooted in relationship, not reward. Silence trains your spirit to listen more deeply, to lean more fully, and to release control more completely. God's silent work is also a form of protection. Sometimes what you want God to expose publicly could actually harm you emotionally, spiritually, or relationally if revealed too soon. You may desire vindication, but God prioritizes your healing. You may crave validation, but God values your peace. Silence shields your heart from unnecessary battles and preserves your dignity. It keeps you from becoming consumed by the behavior of those who hurt you. Instead of letting their actions dominate your thoughts, God draws your attention back to growth, restoration, and forward movement. The quiet season becomes a sacred space where God repairs what pain damaged. Another powerful aspect of divine silence is that it allows truth to surface organically. Forced exposure creates resistance and defensiveness. But when God allows time to pass, truth reveals itself naturally through patterns, behaviors, and outcomes. People eventually show who they truly are. Motives become evident. Integrity stands firm while deception collapses under its own weight. You do not need to campaign for justice when God is already orchestrating truth. What is real will remain. What is false will eventually unravel. Silence becomes the incubator where reality matures enough to speak for itself. In the silent process, God also examines your heart. Pain has a way of uncovering hidden emotions, unresolved wounds, and internal expectations. Silence forces reflection. It exposes areas where forgiveness must grow, where boundaries must strengthen, and where identity must stabilize. God uses quiet moments to cleanse bitterness, heal insecurity, and restore confidence. Without silence, these inner repairs might never occur. You might receive outward justice, but remain inwardly wounded. God cares more about who you become than what happens around you. Silence also dismantles the illusion of control. When you cannot manipulate outcomes, manage timelines, or predict resolutions, you learn to trust divine sovereignty. You begin to understand that God's wisdom exceeds human logic. You learn that delays are not denials, but developments. What feels like waiting is often preparation. What feels like stillness is often alignment. OD arranges people's circumstances, timing, and opportunities in ways that human planning could never accomplish. He positions outcomes that bring growth instead of temporary satisfaction. When visibility finally arrives, it often feels effortless because the hard work was already done in secret. Doors open smoothly, truth becomes undeniable, healing feels complete, peace settles naturally. You realize that the delay was not punishment, but perfection. God was ensuring that when the moment arrived, it would bring stability rather than chaos, clarity rather than confusion, and peace rather than emotional turbulence. The visible breakthrough becomes sustainable because the invisible foundation was properly built. Learning to trust God's silent work reshapes your perspective on life. You stop demanding immediate answers. You stop rushing divine processes. You stop measuring progress by surface evidence. Instead, you become sensitive to inner peace, spiritual growth, emotional maturity, and de-alignment with purpose. You learn to rest while God works. You learn to release what you cannot control. You learn to trust what you cannot yet see. This understanding transforms pain into patience and uncertainty into confidence. It teaches you that even when nothing seems to be happening, everything may be aligning. God never wastes silence. He uses it to protect you, grow you, prepare you, and position you for what comes next. When you embrace this truth, waiting no longer feels like abandonment. It becomes partnership. You may not see his hands moving, but you can trust his heart is guiding every detail toward healing, justice, and restoration. Healing your heart being God's first priority reveals how deeply he values your future more than your past. When someone hurts you, the natural instinct is to want immediate justice, apology, or validation. The mind replays the offense, the emotions revisit the wound, and the heart quietly longs for closure. Yet God understands something that human logic often overlooks. Unresolved pain can shape identity if it is allowed to remain unhealed. Before addressing what others did wrong, God gently turns his attention toward restoring what was damaged inside you. He knows that if your heart remains wounded, even the best external outcome cannot bring lasting peace. Pain has a way of embedding itself into the subconscious. It influences trust, decision-making, confidence, and emotional safety. Without healing, bitterness can quietly grow roots that affect future relationships, spiritual intimacy, and personal joy. God does not want you carrying yesterday's pain into tomorrow's blessings. That is why he begins his work not by changing the offender, but by changing the condition of your heart. He frees you from emotional bondage so that what happened to you does not continue happening within you. Healing does not mean pretending the pain never existed. God never dismisses your wounds. He invites honesty, tears, questions, vulnerability. He allows you to grieve what was lost, whether it was trust, innocence, opportunity, or connection. Healing is the process of bringing the wound into the presence of God so that his truth, comfort, and peace can slowly replace the pain. It is not rushed, forced, or artificial. It is gentle, progressive, and deeply personal. One of the first signs of inner healing is when the emotional reaction to the memory begins to soften. The same thought that once triggered anger, sadness, or anxiety begins to lose its power. The memory still exists, but it no longer controls your emotional state. This is not forgetfulness, it is freedom. God removes the sting while preserving the lesson. He teaches your heart that it is safe again, that you are protected, and that your future is not defined by what hurt you. Another part of healing is restoring self-worth. Pain often carries silent lies, that you are not enough, that you deserve the treatment, that you cannot trust again, vulnerability is dangerous, that love always ends in loss. God dismantles these lies through truth. He reminds you of your identity, your value, your dignity, and your worth. He rebuilds confidence that was shaken. He restores the ability to love wisely without fear. This internal restoration is far more valuable than external revenge because it shapes the quality of your entire life. God also heals by teaching boundaries. Healing does not always mean reconciliation or re-entry into the same dynamic. Sometimes healing means learning when to say no. when to protect your peace, when to honor your emotional safety, and when to walk away from unhealthy patterns. God strengthens discernment so that you no longer tolerate what damages your spirit. Boundaries are not walls of bitterness, they are gates of wisdom. Forgiveness becomes possible only when healing begins. Forgiveness is not approval of wrong behavior, and it is not denial of pain. It is the release of emotional debt so that your heart can move forward unburdened. God empowers forgiveness by first stabilizing your emotions, restoring your security, and reminding you that justice belongs to Him. When forgiveness flows from healing instead of pressure, it becomes liberating rather than exhausting. Another dimension of God's healing work is replacing fear with peace. Pain often creates emotional hypervigilance, constantly anticipating disappointment, betrayal, or rejection. God gently teaches your nervous system to rest again. Peace returns not because circumstances are perfect, but because your heart learns to trust God's protection. You stop scanning for danger and start living with calm confidence. Healing also renews your spiritual intimacy. Pain can create distance between you and God if unanswered questions remain buried. But when healing occurs, prayer becomes honest again. Trust deepens, dependence increases. God becomes more than a solution. He becomes refuge. Your faith matures through vulnerability rather than performance. When God heals your heart first, He protects you from becoming hardened. Pain has the potential to make people cynical, guarded, controlling, or emotionally numb. God preserves your tenderness while strengthening your wisdom. He keeps your compassion alive while sharpening your discernment. You remain loving without being naive. You remain open without being unprotected. This balance is a powerful mark of spiritual maturity. The greatest danger of unresolved pain is that it can quietly shape your future choices. People often repeat cycles not because they want to, but because they never healed from the previous wound. God interrupts this pattern by addressing the root before allowing new chapters to unfold. He prepares you emotionally for healthier relationships, better opportunities, stronger confidence, and greater purpose. When your heart heals, you stop needing closure from people. You stop requiring apologies to move forward. You stop waiting for validation to feel whole. Your peace becomes internally anchored instead of externally dependent. That is true freedom. That is divine restoration. God's priority is not simply fixing what happened. It is forming who you become. A healed heart sees clearly, loves wisely, trusts steadily, and lives confidently. When God heals you first, He ensures that whatever comes next in your life will be received by a whole heart rather than a wounded one. This is why healing your heart is not secondary. It is sacred. Truth has a way of breathing even when it is buried, and when God becomes your defender, you no longer need to exhaust yourself trying to explain, justify, or prove what you endured. When someone hurts you, especially through deception, manipulation, or false narratives, the natural instinct is to defend your name, protect your image, and correct every misunderstanding. The mind imagines conversations that never happen, arguments that never resolve, and explanations that never fully satisfy. Yet God often invites you into a higher posture, silence anchored in trust, not because your story does not matter, but because He knows that forced defense often fuels conflict instead of clarity. When God takes over the defense of your truth, He operates in ways that no human strategy could replicate. He arranges circumstances where reality speaks louder than accusations. Patterns begin revealing themselves. Behavior exposes character. Consistency validates integrity. Over time, what is authentic naturally stands, while what is false begins collapsing under its own weight. You may notice that people who once doubted start observing inconsistencies. Conversations shift without your involvement. Perspectives change quietly. This is the invisible hand of God working in alignment with truth. One of the greatest freedoms in spiritual maturity is realizing that you do not have to be understood by everyone to live peacefully. When God becomes your advocate, your identity no longer depends on public approval. You stop chasing validation. You stop explaining your pain to people who cannot comprehend it. You stop reopening wounds to prove innocence. Instead, you rest in the confidence that God knows the full story, the motives, the intentions, the tears that fell when no one was watching. His understanding is sufficient even when human understanding fails. Defending yourself often drains emotional energy and prolongs attachment to the pain. Every attempt to correct the narrative keeps the wound active in your mind. God invites you to release that burden so your healing can progress without interruption. When you step back, you create space for peace. You allow your nervous system to settle. You free your heart from constant emotional engagement with the past. Silence becomes a shield rather than a weakness. God's truth revelation process is rarely dramatic. It unfolds through time, observation, and divine orchestration. People eventually notice tone chang, ease, repeated behaviors, inconsistent stories, or patterns of relational damage. Without your intervention, reality speaks. Integrity carries a quiet authority that does not need self-promotion. When you remain consistent, kind, grounded, and emotionally stable, your life itself becomes the evidence. Your peace becomes the testimony. Your growth becomes the proof. Another powerful aspect of allowing God to defend your truth is that it preserves your humility and character. If vindication arrives through personal confrontation or argument, pride can easily contaminate the victory. But when God reveals truth independently, gratitude replaces arrogance. You remain grounded. You remain compassionate. You avoid becoming hardened or aggressive. Your spirit stays aligned with grace rather than bitterness. God also protects you from misusing information. In moments of hurt, people often reveal sensitive details impulsively, hoping to gain sympathy or validation. This can create unnecessary broken trust, and further relational damage. God's quiet defense prevents you from exposing things that were never meant to become public. He guards your integrity while handling justice himself. As truth surfaces naturally, it often brings clarity not only to others, but also to yourself. You gain confirmation that your experience was real, valid, and seen by God. Doubt dissolves. Self-blame weakens. Confusion settles. This internal validation strengthens emotional healing and restores confidence. You no longer question your perception or minimize your pain. You stand peacefully in your truth without hostility. Trusting God to reveal truth also deepens spiritual maturity. It teaches patience, surrender, and emotional discipline. It trains the heart to rest instead of react. It cultivates faith in divine timing instead of human urgency. Over time, you begin to recognize that not every misunderstanding requires correction. Not every accusation deserves a response, and not every lie needs confrontation. Some battles are spiritual, not verbal. When truth finally becomes visible, it often arrives gently rather than explosively. People simply see clearly. Relationships realign naturally. Respect shifts quietly. No dramatic announcements are required. You may not even be present when the realization occurs. Yet the peace that follows confirms that God has defended your honor more effectively than you ever could have. Even if some people never fully understand, God's defense remains sufficient. Your calling is not to convince the world. It is to remain faithful, healed, and aligned with integrity. Living truthfully is more powerful than arguing truth. Your consistency speaks louder than your explanations. When you trust God with your reputation, you also protect your emotional health. You free yourself from the exhausting cycle of monitoring opinions and managing perceptions. You gain mental clarity. You reclaim emotional energy for growth, joy, creativity, and purpose. Peace replaces performance. Authenticity replaces anxiety. Allowing God to defend your truth also strengthens your ability to forgive. When you no longer feel responsible for correcting injustice, resentment loosens its grip. You stop carrying the burden of moral judgment. You trust that God sees all perspectives fully and will handle accountability appropriately. This releases your heart from hidden anger and restores emotional balance. Ultimately, truth revealed by God carries authority that human argument cannot match. It restores order without creating chaos. It corrects without cruelty. It clarifies without conflict. When God becomes your advocate, you experience a quiet confidence that cannot be shaken by misunderstanding or misrepresentation. You learn to walk forward with dignity, trusting that what is real will endure and what is false will fade. Your peace becomes the loudest proof that God has already spoken on your behalf. When God begins to deal with the purrs on who caused harm, one of the most profound ways he works is through inner conviction rather than outward exposure. Human eyes often look for visible consequences, public apologies, or immediate accountability, but divine correction frequently starts deep within the conscience. The heart becomes restless. Peace fades. A quiet discomfort begins stirring beneath the surface. This unrest is not random anxiety or emotional instability. It is the gentle yet firm voice of God calling the soul toward truth, responsibility, and transformation. Inner conviction is God's mercy in motion. It is his way of awakening awareness without destroying dignity. Instead of humiliating someone publicly, God speaks privately to the heart. Thoughts become heavier. Memories resurface. Certain moments replay internally. The weight of words spoken or actions taken begins pressing against the conscience. The person may not immediately understand why they feel unsettled, but the spirit recognizes that something is out of alignment. This discomfort is an invitation to reflection, repentance, and change. Conviction differs greatly from condemnation. Condemnation produces shame, fear, and hopelessness. Conviction produces clarity, responsibility, and opportunity for growth. God does not seek to crush the person who caused harm. He seeks to restore truth within them. He reveals the impact of their behavior not to punish them emotionally, but to awaken their moral awareness. When someone begins feeling the emotional weight of what they did, it means God is actively engaging their conscience. This internal unrest can manifest in many subtle ways. Sleep becomes disturbed, joy feels incomplete, satisfaction fades, distractions no longer silence the mind, even success feels hollow, the heart feels uneasy, even in moments that once brought pleasure. Conversations may trigger discomfort unexpectedly, silence becomes louder. These are signs that the spirit is wrestling with unresolved truth. God is general. Try removing the numbing effect that allowed harmful behavior to feel normal. Often the person may begin questioning their own motives. They may feel drawn to reflect on past decisions. Regret surfaces. Rationalizations begin losing their power. Excuses no longer fully satisfy the conscience. This internal dialogue is not accidental. It is spiritual awakening. God is recalibrating their moral compass. He is reintroducing sensitivity to right and wrong. You may never witness this process externally. They may never express it publicly. They may continue functioning socially while carrying private conviction internally. But just as God heals you privately, he corrects others privately. Spiritual work often happens in the hidden places of the soul where no audience exists. God values internal transformation more than external performance. Inner conviction can also create emotional tension within their relationships. The person may become irritable, withdrawn, defensive, or unusually IET. They may feel unsettled in familiar environments. They may experience a growing awareness that certain patterns no longer bring peace. This discomfort pushes the heart toward reevaluation. God uses this unrest to interrupt destructive cycles and invite personal accountability. Sometimes conviction eventually leads to humility. The heart softens, pride weakens. A desire for reconciliation or change may begin forming. Not everyone responds positively to conviction. Some resist it, suppress it, or ignore it. But the presence of conviction itself proves that God has not abandoned their conscience. He continues reaching out even when behavior was harmful for the person who was hurt. Understanding this process brings peace. You no longer need to carry the burden of ensuring accountability. You release the need for visible justice. You trust that God addresses hearts more thoroughly than humans ever could. This allows you to heal without obsessing over their outcome. It is important to you to recognize that inner conviction is often more powerful than public consequence. External punishment can change behavior temporarily, but internal conviction transforms identity. When the conscience awakens, the person begins seeing themselves differently. Values shift. Awareness expands. Responsibility deepens. This is where lasting change begins. Conviction also dismantles denial. It breaks the false narratives people use to justify harmful actions. The mind may try to suppress guilt, but the heart continues sensing truth. Over time, the emotional tension increases until honesty becomes unavoidable. This process is not comfortable, but it is redemptive. Sometimes conviction leads to apology, repentance, and repaired relationships. Other times it simply restrains future harmful behavior. Either way, God's involvement ensures that wrongdoing does not go unaddressed internally. Justice is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet and deeply transformative. This internal work of D also protects your own heart from bitterness. Knowing that God handles conscience allows you to release resentment. You stop wishing for punishment. You stop replaying the offense. You trust divine correction instead of personal revenge. Peace replaces anger. Compassion replaces hostility. Emotional freedom becomes possible. Understanding conviction reshapes how you interpret silence. Silence no longer feels like neglect. It feels like divine engagement happening beyond your sight. God does not need your involvement to confront wrongdoing. He speaks directly to hearts. When you trust that God convicts those who caused harm, you gain emotional closure without requiring human acknowledgement. Your healing becomes independent of their response. You no longer wait for apologies or explanations to move forward. You trust that accountability exists even if unseen. Inner conviction is one of the greatest evidences that God is active in human lives. It proves that no action is invisible, no motive is hidden, and no harm is ignored. God's justice flows through conscience, truth, and spiritual awareness. Even when you cannot witness it, transformation is unfolding quietly. This truth allows your heart to rest. You no longer carry the burden of ensuring fairness. You release control and embrace peace. You trust divine wisdom, and in that trust, your spirit becomes lighter, freer, and more hopeful, knowing that God addresses every heart with perfect understanding and timing. Pain has a mysterious way of trying to define a person. But when God steps into the process, what was meant to wound becomes the very soil that produces growth, strength, and unexpected favor. Human logic assumes that suffering only subtracts, only weakens, only delays progress. Yet divine wisdom transforms pain into preparation. The experience that once felt like destruction becomes the foundation for wisdom, maturity, and purpose. God never wastes what hurts you. He redeems it. When someone sees deep emotional pain, the natural response is to shrink, to protect, to hesitate, or to withdraw from risk. Confidence may weaken. Trust may feel dangerous. Dreams may feel fragile. But God gently reverses this internal damage by reshaping perspective. Instead of allowing pain to imprison your potential, He teaches your heart to extract lessons instead of carrying wounds. You begin recognizing patterns you once overlooked. You gain discernment where you once trusted blindly. You develop emotional strength where you once felt vulnerable. Pain sharpens perception when guided by wisdom. Growth often appears quietly at first. You may notice your reactions changing. What once triggered anxiety no longer controls your emotions. What once made you doubt yourself now strengthens your confidence. You learn how to communicate more clearly, set healthier boundaries, and trust your intuition without fear. These are invisible upgrades, internal improvements that later manifest in visible outcome. God strengthens your character long before He expands your opportunities. Favor frequently follows maturity. As your emotional stability increases, your leadership capacity expands. As your discernment sharpens, your decision-making improves. As your confidence stabilizes, your influence grows. People naturally trust individuals who carry calm clarity rather than emotional chaos. God often positions healed people into greater responsibility because they can steward success without being controlled by insecurity or unresolved pain. What once hurt you becomes the training ground that qualifies you for what comes next. Pain also deepens empathy. You become more compassionate toward others who suffer. You listen more carefully. You judge less quickly. You understand emotional complexity. This depth allows your relationships to mature beyond surface connection. You become safer emotionally for others because you have learned how fragile the heart can be. God uses your healed pain to bring comfort, wisdom, and encouragement to others walking through similar struggles. Your story becomes medicine for someone else's wounds. Another form of growth that emerges from pain is spiritual depth. When comfort is disrupted, reliance on God increases. Prayer becomes more honest. Faith becomes more personal. Trust becomes more intentional. You stop treating God as a distant solution and begin experiencing Him as an intimate refuge. This spiritual maturity stabilizes your identity. You no longer define yourself by human approval, circumstances, or past losses. Your worth becomes anchored in divine truth. God also transforms pain into discipline and focus. When you experience disappointment, you often become clearer about what truly matters. Distractions lose their appeal. Time becomes more valuable. Energy becomes more intentional. You invest in what nourishes your soul rather than what merely entertains or impresses. Pain clarifies priorities and simplifies direction. Seated favor often appears not as reward, but as alignment. New relationships enter your life that carry health rather than chaos. Opportunities arise that reflect your growth rather than your insecurity. Doors open that match your maturity. God positions you into environments that nurture rather than drain you. You begin experiencing momentum that flows naturally rather than through forced striving. Favor becomes a reflection of inner alignment rather than external chasing. Pain also develops resilience. You discover that you can survive what once felt impossible. Your confidence strengthens because you trust your ability to navigate difficulty with wisdom and faith. Fear loses its authority because experience has proven your endurance. You stop underestimating your strength. This resilience empowers you to pursue goals without being paralyzed by potential setbacks. God often uses pain to realign identity. You stop seeing yourself as fragile, broken, or defeated. You begin recognizing strength, endurance, wisdom, and courage. The narrative shifts from victimhood to victory, not because the pain disappears from memory, but because it no longer defines your worth or direction. You become the author of a new chapter shaped by growth rather than grief. Another layer of favor emerges in emotional peace. When you are healed, you experience contentment that is independent of circumstances. You no longer chase external validation to feel secure. You no longer measure success solely by comparison. Peace becomes your internal environment. This emotional stability attracts healthy connections and sustainable success. God's transformation of pain also builds gratitude. You recognize how far you have come. You appreciate clarity you once lacked. You value peace you once longed for. Gratitude deepens joy and strengthens perspective. You no longer take emotional health for granted. Perhaps the most powerful outcome of redeemed pain is purpose. You begin understanding how your experiences uniquely qualify you to serve, lead, encourage, or create. Your testimony carries authenticity because it was lived, not learned. Your wisdom carries authority because it was earned through endurance. God uses what once hurt you as the very tool that blesses others and fulfills destiny. When pain becomes soil instead of poison, life begins producing fruit instead of bitterness. Growth replaces stagnation. Favor replaces fear. Wisdom replaces wounds. God transforms suffering into strength, disappointment into direction, and brokenness into beauty. What once tried to destroy you becomes the very evidence that you were being prepared for something greater all along. When God begins restructuring the environment and relationships around someone who continues in harmful patterns, it is not an act of cruelty, but an act of correction and mercy. Human thinking often associates correction with punishment, but divine correction is rooted in restoration and alignment. God understood. Yes, that behavior is often reinforced by environment. Certain relationships, platforms, privileges, and opportunities can unintentionally enable destructive attitudes, unhealthy choices, or harmful treatment of others. When these environments remain unchanged, growth becomes difficult. So God lovingly intervenes by shifting the surroundings to interrupt destructive cycles and awaken accountability. One of the ways this restructuring happens is through closed doors. Opportunities that once flowed easily may suddenly become difficult. Access that once seemed guaranteed may be removed. Favor that once appeared consistent may slow down. This is not always rejection. Sometimes it is redirection. God removes what strengthens harmful behavior so the heart is forced to reflect rather than continue unchecked. Comfort zones shrink so awareness can expand. When external ease disappears, internal evaluation begins. Relationships may also shift during divine correction. Certain connections weak. Distance increases or conflicts arise that disrupt unhealthy alliances. People who once supported or tolerated harmful behavior may no longer remain close. This isolation is not abandonment, it is recalibration. God often uses solitude to invite reflection, maturity, and humility. When distractions and enabling voices fade, the conscience becomes louder. The heart gains space to examine motives, patterns, and responsibility. This restructuring may feel confusing or unfair to the person experiencing it. They may not immediately recognize that God is protecting them from deeper damage. They may interpret closed doors as bad luck, rejection, or injustice, but divine correction often disguises itself as inconvenience before revealing itself as wisdom. God sees long-term impact while humans see short-term comfort. Environmental shifts also interrupt automatic behavior. Habits form easily when surroundings remain constant. When God rearranges circumstances, old patterns become harder to repeat. New awareness develops. New choices become necessary. This friction creates growth. Without friction, character often stagnates. God uses discomfort to stimulate transformation. Another layer of divine restructuring is the removal of platforms that amplify harmful influence. Influence carries responsibility. When behavior lacks integrity, God may temporarily limit visibility, authority, or access. This protects others from harm while giving the individual space to recalibrate. God values character more than exposure. He prioritizes inner alignment over external success. For the person who was hurt, understanding this principle brings peace. You no longer feel responsible for ensuring accountability or consequences. You trust that God addresses the roots, not just the symptoms. You release the need for revenge or validation. You rest in divine justice rather than emotional reaction. God's correction also protects future relationships. When harmful behavior goes unchecked, it multiplies damage across multiple lives. By intervening early through environmental shifts, God prevents deeper wounds. This mercy extends not only to the individual being corrected, but also to those they may encounter in the future. Sometimes restructuring leads to humility. When familiar supports disappear, dependence on self decreases. Pride weakens, reflection deepens, gratitude grows, awareness increases. The heart becomes more receptive to truth. God uses humility as the doorway to transformation. Not every person responds positively to divine correction. Some resist, harden, or blame others. But the presence of restructuring itself confirms that God is actively intervening. He does not ignore destructive patterns. He interrupts them for the sake of growth and protection. Environmental shifts may also involve financial pressure, career redirection, social changes, or personal challenges. These experiences slow momentum and create space for evaluation. God sometimes reduces external noise so internal clarity can emerge. When life becomes quieter or simpler, the soul becomes more attentive. This restructuring process mirrors loving discipline. Just as a parent adjusts a child's environment to teach responsibility, God adjusts life circumstances to guide wisdom. Discipline is not rejection, it is investment. It communicates value, care, and long-term vision. For the person who was harmed, recognizing this divine pattern brings emotional release. You no longer monitor the other person's outcome. You no longer measure fairness by visible consequences. You trust divine intelligence to manage correction appropriately. Your peace becomes independent of their progress. Understanding divine correction also protects your heart from bitterness. Instead of wishing harm, you develop compassion for growth. You recognize that transformation often requires discomfort. You release anger and embrace peace. God's restructuring often prepares both parties for healthier futures. The one corrected gains opportunity for maturity. The one healed gains freedom to move forward without emotional attachment to the past. Both benefit from divine alignment, even if paths never reconnect. When environments shift under God's guidance, it signals that growth is underway, even if results are not immediately visible. Change begins beneath the surface before manifesting externally. God values lasting transformation over temporary appearances. Divine correction does not destroy identity. It refines it. It does not eliminate potential. It redirects it. It does not shame. It awakens responsibility. God rearranges surroundings to protect hearts, preserve futures, and restore order. Trusting this process allows you to release control, resentment, and fear. You rest in the confidence that God handles justice wisely, gently, and thoroughly. You move forward in peace, knowing that divine correction operates beyond what human eyes can measure. Clarity is one of the greatest gifts that emerges after pain has been processed through healing. When someone hurts you, confusion often follows. You may question your judgment, your worth, your memory, and even your spiritual discernment. You replay conversations wondering if you misunderstood, overreacted, or somehow caused the situation. Emotional trauma can blur perception and distort self-trust. But when God begins restoring clarity, the fog lifts and understanding returns gently, steadily, and truthfully. This clarity is not fueled by bitterness or revenge. It is anchored in wisdom, self-awareness, and spiritual maturity. Clarity helps you separate responsibility from guilt. You begin recognizing what was truly yours to carry and what was never yours to own. You release false responsibility for someone else's choices, behavior, or emotional immaturity. This separation brings emotional freedom. You stop punishing yourself for things you could not control. You stop internalizing blame that never belongs to you. Your conscience becomes lighter. Your self-respect strengthens. You learn to honor your own emotional reality without distortion. Discernment sharpens when you understand patterns rather than isolated incidents. You recognize early warning signs you once overlooked. You notice inconsistencies in communication, emotional availability, accountability, and respect. Instead of romanticizing behavior or minimizing discomfort, you trust your intuition. Discernment is not suspicion, it is awareness. It protects your heart without hardening it. You remain open to connection while remaining grounded in truth. Clarity also strengthens boundaries. You begin understanding what behaviors you'll no longer tolerate and what values you must protect. Boundaries are not walls that isolate. They are filters that preserve peace. They guide your choices in relationships, communication, time investment, and emotional vulnerability. Healthy boundaries prevent emotional burnout and repeated pleas of harm. They allow you to love wisely rather than blindly. Another layer of clarity comes through emotional literacy. You become better at identifying your feelings, needs, triggers, and limits. Instead of suppressing emotions or reacting impulsively, you respond with intention. You communicate more honestly. You listen more attentively. You regulate stress more effectively. Emotional intelligence increases stability and relational health. Clarity also reshapes your expectations. You stop expecting broken people to provide healthy love. You stop seeking validation from unsafe sources. You stop hoping someone will become who they consistently show they are not. This realism protects your emotional investment. It allows you to align expectations with reality rather than fantasy. Disappointment decreases when expectations become accurate. Discernment empowers you to choose differently in the future. You no longer repeat familiar patterns simply because they feel comfortable. You choose relationships based on character rather than chemistry alone. You prioritize emotional safety, mutual respect, consistency, and integrity. Your standards rise not from arrogance, but from self-respect and wisdom. Clarity also deepens spiritual awareness. You recognize how God guided you even in the pain. You see where intuition warned you. You recognize moments of protection you once misunderstood. Gratitude replaces regret. You begin trusting God's guidance more confidently moving forward. Faith becomes practical rather than theoretical. Another benefit of clarity is the ability to forgive without forgetting wisdom. Forgiveness no longer means vulnerability without boundaries. It means releasing resentment while retaining discernment. You no longer confuse kindness with access. You learn how to love without self-abandonment. This balance, CE protects both compassion and self-respect. Clarity strengthens confidence. You trust your perception. You trust your decision-making. You trust your inner voice again. This confidence reduces anxiety and indecision. You move forward with calm assurance rather than second-guessing. You become more decisive, more grounded, more secure. When clarity increases, emotional triggers lose their power. Old memories no longer hijack your nervous system. You respond rather than react. You remain present rather than trapped in the past. This emotional regulation increases peace and stability. Clarity also refines communication. You express needs directly rather than expecting others to guess. You articulate boundaries respectfully. You address concerns calmly rather than suppressing them. Healthy communication prevents misunderstanding and emotional buildup. Discernment also protects your time and energy. You invest where growth, respect, and alignment exist. You withdraw from draining dynamics. You become intentional with your commitments. Life becomes simpler, calmer, and more focused. Clarity reduces fear of repeating the past. Instead of avoiding connection altogether, you approach relationships with wisdom rather than anxiety. You trust yourself to recognize warning signs early. This confidence restores openness without vulnerability to harm. Ultimately, clarity transforms pain into intelligence. Your experience becomes education rather than trauma. Your story becomes guidance rather than burden. Wisdom replaces wounds. Discernment replaces doubt. You move forward empowered rather than wounded. God's gift of clarity protects your future. It equips you to build healthier relationships, make wiser decisions, and steward emotional peace. You no longer walk blindly into patterns that once hurt you. You walk consciously, confidently, and securely into a future shaped by wisdom rather than fear. Peace is the ultimate evidence that God has intervened, even when justice or resolution is not immediately visible. It is not merely the absence of conflict or the lack of emotional reaction. It is an internal state that transcends circumstances. When someone has hurt you deeply, your mind naturally searches for closure, validation, or revenge. The heart longs to see balance restored, apology spoken, or accountability enforced. Yet God offers a higher form of resolution, peace that surpasses logic, peace that confirms he is working even when you cannot perceive it, and peace that frees you from the burden of controlling outcomes. True peace comes from releasing the need to manage the situation yourself. When someone wrongs you, it is easy to carry the weight of their choices, replaying the offense repeatedly and imagining scenarios where justice is delivered. This mental rehearsal can consume energy, distort perspective, and prolong emotional pain. God's peace emerges when you surrender that weight, acknowledging that he sees all things, understands the motives, and will act perfectly in his timing. The release is not passive resignation. It is active trust. You are no longer the arbiter of justice. God is. Peace also arises when the soul trusts that what is hidden will eventually be revealed. Lies, deceit, and manipulation may cloud your understanding of the situation, but God assures that truth is never lost. While you wait, peace guards your heart from bitterness and obsession. You stop defining your emotional state by whether the person apologizes or whether the world acknowledges what happened. Instead, you anchor your sense of justice and value in God's omniscience and goodness. This peace is stabilizing, like a steady hand holding you amid turbulence. Another aspect of divine peace is emotional freedom. When God deals with those who hurt you, he removes the emotional charge attached to the memory. Thoughts of betrayal no longer trigger rage, sadness, or anxiety. The pain may still exist, but it no longer dominates your internal landscape. You can recall the events without reliving the torment. This freedom is not achieved by denying reality or pretending nothing happened. It is achieved through spiritual restoration, where God replaces fear, resentment, and obsession with calm assurance. Peace also allows you to move forward without external validation. You no longer require apologies, recognition, or public vindication to feel whole. You are freed from waiting for the person who hurt you to change, repent, or acknowledge wrongdoing. Your emotional equilibrium does not depend on human behavior. You trust that God's intervention is sufficient, whether or not it manifests in ways visible to the world. This independence protects your heart from repeated cycles of disappointment. Furthermore, peace reflects a matured faith. It signifies that your trust is no longer rooted in outcomes, but in God himself. When peace is present, you understand that even unanswered questions, delayed justice, or unresolved conflicts are under divine control. You no longer demand immediate explanations or visible consequences. Your focus shifts from reaction to resilience, from revenge to restoration, from despair to hope. Peace becomes both a shield and a guide, keeping your spirit centered while life unfolds around you. Divine peace also transforms relationships and interactions. When your inner state is stable, you no longer respond impulsively to triggers, criticism, or confrontation. You engage with wisdom rather than emotion, discernment rather than reactivity. This calm authority protects you from further harm and strengthens your influence. Others may notice your serenity even in the face of conflict, and it serves as a subtle testimony of God's work in your life. Peace is often accompanied by patience. While you wait for life's outcomes to align or for truth to surface, you rest in the assurance that timing is under divine control. Patience allows you to endure uncertainty without anxiety. Each is that delay does not equal denial, and that unseen work often precedes visible results. The ability to wait calmly is itself a mark of spiritual maturity and emotional intelligence. Another dimension of peace is forgiveness that does not compromise discernment. You can release resentment and desire for retaliation while maintaining boundaries and self-protection. This kind of peace separates your emotional health from the actions of others. You stop using your energy to punish or control and start using it to nurture your growth, your relationships, and your purpose. Forgiveness becomes liberating rather than draining because it is rooted in trust and divine justice rather than human need. Peace also restores perspective. It allows you to see the bigger picture, recognizing that every event contributes to a larger narrative of growth, wisdom, and alignment. Pain becomes instructional rather than destructive. Betrayal becomes a teacher rather than a prison. Loss becomes a gateway rather than a dead end. Through peace, you understand that life is being orchestrated for your benefit, even when immediate circumstances feel unjust or confusing. Finally, peace is transformative. It signals that the heart is no longer captive to past pain. It validates that God has handled the unseen dimensions of the situation. It confirms that healing, growth, and divine alignment are in motion. Peace allows you to embrace the future without fear, to engage with the present without bitterness, and to reflect on the past without obsession. It is the ultimate evidence that God has not abandoned you, ignored your pain, or overlooked injustice. When peace resides in your soul, it is a living testimony of God's sovereignty, wisdom, and love. It shows that you have moved from being a victim of circumstances to being a witness of divine faithfulness. Even without visible resolution, without apologies, without reparation, your inner calm demonstrates that God has already dealt with the situation. Peace is not the absence of struggle. It is the presence of God's restorative work. It transforms wounds into wisdom, trials into triumphs, and pain into preparation for what is next. It is the silent, undeniable proof that God's hand is at work perfectly and immutably, even when you cannot see it.